It's a little bit intimidating here to speak to people who probably know way more than I do about what's been happening in Vancouver and before it was called Vancouver and the area and many connected areas. I'm just an artist. I'm not a historian. I made an artwork based on this situation that occurred in this place I was brought to as a 3-year-old back in 1968 from Hong Kong. And I remember the plane ride with my family and stopping over in Tokyo for a day and hearing another language that I'd never heard of before. It was Japanese. And getting driven around Tokyo because my grandfather was working in Yokohama for a shipping company at the time. He came up to Tokyo, took us around, and he and the chauffeur were speaking Japanese, and my sister and I just thought it was the funniest sounding thing coming out of their mouths, and we mimicked it in our little kid way, just kind of like making sounds. And then we moved, the next day we were here, and then all of a sudden we were self-conscious about who we were. Before that, we were just part of the dominant, I guess, ethnographic demographic in Hong Kong. Didn't know about white people and the British colonists. Didn't know about the South Asians. Didn't know about the South Asians in the police force and the military, or the merchants down in Chungking Mansion. You know, because I was 3. But coming here from one British colonial space to another was a rupture, and also we didn't have the language. So, and I didn't learn English until grade 1. Because I didn't go to kindergarten. My mother had to work, my father had to work. So all this to say that it is deeply embedded within my body, because my body remembers that disruption and that more than just a shift. It was really, really tough to come to a place and then to be identified as Chinese. Whereas back in Hong Kong, we didn't know we were Chinese, or me and my sister didn't know we were Chinese. So coming here and then eventually facing the racism that we faced growing up in Vancouver, which was back then predominantly white. It's much more diverse now. It's interesting how it keeps changing, depending on which part of Greater Vancouver you go to too. It's really fascinating. It's been a big part of my identity. Questioning who I am, my relationship to this place, my relationship to society, greater society in general, specific communities as well, and how this place came to be the way it is. And it's obviously constantly evolving. So when I found out about the 1907 anti-Asian riots in my 20s, I was wondering how come I never came across this before. It's never been introduced to me in any educational or other context. And as an artist, I kept thinking, well, maybe one day I'll make a project about it. I don't know how it would turn out, but you know, it was always in the back of my mind. And because I'm interested in site specificity, I'm interested in analyzing a particular space, whether it's a historical space, a social space, an economic space, or otherwise architectural space, and trying to understand the complexities within, and also the power imbalances. Places that just seem too nice and simple and easy. Oftentimes you have to just scratch the surface. Others have been fraught for a long, long time, but sometimes there's other conditions as well that maintain that instability and maintain that instability for a reason or various reasons too. So for 1907 anti-Asian riots, that's the topic of this book, White Riot, which is based on an art project called 360 Riot Walk, which I will introduce to you later on. And I also want to thank the Vancouver Historical Society for inviting me to come talk tonight. Michael, for your great introduction. John Belshaw, those are my contacts. John reached out to ask me to speak tonight. I'm going to go back a little ways to 1887 because the 1907 anti-Asian riots weren't the first race riots in Vancouver. If you don't count the 1886 first ever municipal election when, who was it? Well, I'll get to it later. But anyways, 1887, February 24th, white workers gathered together, and I think they took some steamships, maybe 2, was it 3 steamships? You guys know about this, 1887 riot. And Dunsmuir, I think it was, hired a bunch of Chinese laborers to clear the trees around Cole Harbor because he wanted to develop it. I think he had the rights to that plot of land. And he got those workers for cheap, right? That's generally how it works. So the white workers who didn't get the contract because, well, they didn't get the job because they would have been paid more, they got angry. They went over and attacked the Chinese and drove them away. They gathered all their bedding and their tents and burned them. The Chinese fled to Chinatown. The white workers, some of the white workers went there and attacked Chinatown as well. It's not too much information that I've come across beyond that, but if anyone knows anything more, I would be happy to talk to you about it. If you have any resources, that'd be great. Photograph on the left is Cole Harbor, Lost Lagoon. So Stanley Park area. It's interesting that that this photograph is attributed to 1887, but I've also found it as 1868. So maybe someone also knows a bit more specifics around that. There's a shack there, obviously. And the image on the right is an image from the dock at Cole Harbor at the foot of Thurlow. So that's around Spratt's Oilery. By the time 1907 came around, there had already been many anti-Asian activist organizations that had sprung up. They had been existing up and down the West Coast for decades, ever since, I guess, as a result, since the gold rush. In 1905, in San Francisco, the Asiatic Exclusion League was first founded, but it was actually known as the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. The Americans had more Koreans because of their military expansion in East Asia. Later, it became renamed as the Asiatic Exclusion League when they added Chinese and Indian immigrants to their list. Vancouver wanted a piece of this action. They liked what they were doing down there. The Vancouver Trades and Labor Council, which is a labor organization, they created their own chapter in early August, I think it was August 12th, 1907, organized their first parade and demonstration for Labor Day, the weekend after Labor Day, which back then was a week prior to the way we have it nowadays. Now, in 1908, I'm going to jump forward after the riots here. By 1908, there were reported 231 affiliated organizations, of which 195 of them were trade unions. And here's a card from Mr. Woodward from, I think, 1926. It's hard to see exactly. So this is from the 20s. Right after the riots here in 1907, the AEL, because of the riots, were forbidden to have further public events. However, that didn't mean membership didn't continue. There was a dwindling after the 1907 riots because they got bad press from the riots, but it really picked up steam. And by the 1921, in August, there was a meeting held where they brought together church leaders, businessmen, and World War I veterans, and representatives from 6 trade unions and the Vancouver Trades and Labor Council. And during this meeting, they issued a program that called for the abolition of all Oriental immigration, as they called it, which led to the campaign resulting in the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, which I'm going to presume some of you should know about. If you don't know about it, you should know about it. There's an exhibition at the Chinese Canadian Museum in Chinatown, which is really important. You should go check it out. Now, Mr. Woodward was not connected to the Woodward's department store family. He was actually a florist from Victoria. Here's some information, background. I'm not going to go into this, but I took a look at some of the legislations that were passed that were anti-Chinese and anti-Indigenous, and then anti-Japanese, and then anti-South Asian. The Chinese and Indigenous were targeted first because there were more of them, especially the Indigenous. But between 1871 and 1900, in a short amount of time, in less than 3 decades, 88 anti-Chinese specific acts were passed through Victoria's legislature. There were others that didn't pass, but well, they stood a pretty good chance. So what happened during the 1907 demonstration that was organized by the AEL? They began at, back then it was called Beatty Street, the Beatty Street grounds, which is now known as Larwell Park, next to the Beatty Street Drill Hall, you know, with the tank and the cannon outside. That's where the Vancouver Art Gallery is building their now $600 million building. And soon to be what, 7? Started at 4? Yeah. And that's where they gathered. The mayor of Vancouver, Alexander Bethune, was one of the first people to sign up for the AEL, including other city councilors. They went to the very first meeting, August 12th. He and the city councilors offered the City Hall chambers as the place to go to for the rally, so they can drum up more support to keep Asians out of Canada, especially British Columbia. So this is where they started off. There were 2 marching bands. The mayor and his wife were in a car. Not many cars in Vancouver back then. It was led by the major of the Beatty Street Drill Hall, a Major Brown, and there were thousands of people who came out, white people. They were prominent clergy members, leaders of the Christian churches in Vancouver, trade and labor people, and they marched with all these banners that had written on them, Rule Britannia and White Canada Forever. They walked towards Hastings Street, which was the central business district of Vancouver at the time. Then they turned right to go to Old Market Hall. And Old Market Hall was where City Hall was at that time in 1907 until, what's it say here? I think it was the 30s, wasn't it? 30s? And then yeah, okay. And then we went up to Cambie Street, right? No, it was in another one after that?
The Holden building on East Hastings.
Right. Right, okay. And then Cambie was, Cambie and 12th was way far. It was like still trees around there. Yeah, interesting. So Old Market Hall was where City Hall was. The chambers were up on the 2nd floor. I think the 1st floor was a market, and then they had some auditorium that could hold quite a few people. Speeches were made. There was a runner who went back and forth between the speeches being made outside and being relayed to the crowd outside of thousands of people somehow, crowded around there. Special guest speakers, activists, anti-Asian activists from Seattle and New Zealand came up for this event. They were well organized, obviously. So inflammatory, hysterical speeches were being made. The crowd got so worked up, a mob broke out and headed towards Chinatown. Now, if you are South Asian and you know your local history, when someone refers to the 1907 anti-Asian riots, they might think about Bellingham first. And chronologically, that's the right place to think of around these areas, because they had their own riot on September 4th, when white mill workers, hundreds of them, I think it was 300, quite a few, rounded up the South Asian mill workers from their beds, actually, and beat them up. And the ones who could still walk, they forced marched them out of town or onto trains going mostly south, maybe east, but others ended up at the border, and they were only allowed into Canada because they were British subjects. They got here just in time to witness another race riot, this time not aimed specifically at them. Because there weren't as many South Asians in town, and they weren't seen as the same kind of threat as the Chinese and the Japanese. Now, we already had the head tax then. It was already $500. So there weren't a lot of Chinese coming over at that time, but there were a lot of Japanese workers coming through Hawaii. I think there was a bubonic plague that had broken out in Hawaii and been around for a couple of years, maybe more. So other people were also trying to not die from the plague. And there was work to be had here. There were railroads being built up north. There was the fisheries and the canneries and then also the mills. So back to Vancouver. This mob went down Market Alley, and there was the Pantages Theatre being built at that time. There's one report saying that a boy had joined the mob, picked up a brick from the Pantages construction site, threw it through a window, and that got everyone all excited and decided to follow suit. The crowd was very careful in choosing the Chinese establishments and homes, and not the white proprietors. It wasn't all Chinese in that area, but predominantly. The Chinese had mostly been very nervous, and same with the Japanese. Most of them were already locked down in their homes because they were afraid of violence. And so there weren't many people on the street, if any. It took a little while for the Chinese to organize and start to set up patrols and try to take back their streets. And then they started fighting back. Now this is an image from Fongoons, who was a reputable tailor. He was one of the top tailors in Vancouver. He had lots of white customers as well. He must have charged extra because he was, well known. And this building is still there on the corner of Hastings and I think Columbia. And this is another image taken by Philip Timms. And this is Shanghai Alley. Shanghai Alley, has anyone been to Shanghai Alley lately? Yeah, it ain't what it used to be. It's really desolate and it's really ugly. And you can't even imagine that this was super high density because the Chinese needed to protect themselves in their own community for fear of being targeted. But this is where they also had an opera house, Cantonese opera house, on the second floor. Dr. Sun Yat-sen came and gave speeches here. So yeah, this was the center of Chinatown back then, and this is a photograph of the damages afterwards. I only know of 4 photographs taken after the riots. If anyone here knows of any others, please let me know. And I'm talking about Chinatown specifically. And they're all Philip Timms photographs he took for the province. There wasn't a sun back then. So, and this is, anybody recognize this photograph? The location, the Asahi baseball team played there. Powell Street grounds, exactly. Yes, I think this photograph is from 1898 or something. Maybe 1905, but I think it's the early one, 1898. So Powell Street grounds is pretty much where the riots ended. It started Saturday night, September 7th, and it ended early Monday morning, September 9th. And the very last recorded act was some guys, probably really drunk, trying to light on fire the Japanese language school, which was all wood back then. It was on the same block as the current one on Alexander Street, 400 block, but on the other end of the block. Now, it's interesting how the police told the gun stores to stop selling guns and ammunition to the Chinese, specifically, but not others. In the newspapers, in the English language newspapers, it's also interesting how they describe the Chinese being relatively weak and not fighting back in the same way that the Japanese fought back. But there are various reasons for that kind of depiction. One was that, well, the Japanese had way more time to prepare. because the Chinese got attacked first. So they got out, they set up barricades, and they put out their rocks and bricks and bottles up on the roofs, and they were prepared for the attack. The Chinese did start to fight back, but they needed some time to organize. But the way that the Chinese and Japanese were perceived, and also internationally, the Chinese were relatively weak because of China just about being already being divvied up by different foreign nations and Japan, and the empire was the emperor was going to the empire was about to implode anyways, and the Japanese were a up and rising nation, and they didn't have the head tax to have to deal with, and there was more of a merchant class. They weren't as, and of course, most people in Vancouver back then were poor in general, right? Resource economy, resource extraction. But Japan had just been Russia in a war of 1905, which was really significant. And they had trade relations, economic and political relationship with England. So yeah, very different power differential there. Also, a lot of the Japanese, especially the business folks, they would wear Western clothing. The Chinese hadn't started doing that on a regular basis. So there were cultural, political, and economic differences between the two, and they were portrayed that way in the white media, and perpetuating that as well. So the first project I actually worked on addressing the 1907 anti-Asian riots was a pop-up food project that was located along the route of the demonstration and parade of the 1907 anti-Asian riots, called Riot Food Here, and basically asking the question, what would you have eaten as an angry white man before you went out to attack the Chinese in their homes, or the Japanese? What would you have eaten in Chinatown or Powell Street area before the angry white men came to attack you in your homes? What would you have eaten as a South Asian watching the white men attack the other Asians in Vancouver? And what would you have eaten watching the angry white men attack the Asian people on your land? So those 5 cultural perspectives are represented through food that people might have been eating in 1907. So here we have the menu on the left. We have salmon with pickled spruce tips. Anyone ever have spruce tips? They come out in May. It's the lighter color, tender shoots that come out at the beginning. They're good for about 3-4 weeks. After that, you're gonna have to spit it out. It gets tough. And then dal and chapati for the Punjabi reference. The white reference was as if you have a nice Sunday meal, then you go out and attack folks in Chinatown. Roast beef, horseradish, Yorkshire pudding. For the Chinese, really poor person's meal, congee. You take your rice and you don't have much of it, so you just add more water, you stretch it out. Congee with pork, and the chef actually added corn, which I thought was interesting, because only in North America would you get corn added to your food. Everywhere else it's like pig food, right? You feed your animals with the corn, but here we know sweet corn. And mochi. Mochi being a reference to the relative wealth of the Japanese, and they actually had sweet shops. It was such a luxury to have desserts, anything sweet. The chef was Michael Barnholden's son, and I'll refer to Michael Barnholden more later, but Chris Barnholden, he's somebody whose work I've followed over the years, and I asked him if he would want to collaborate on this project, and he said, yeah, sure. I was introduced to him by his father, Michael Barnholden, whom some of you might know as being a local poet and the author of a book called Reading the Riot Act, a brief history of riots in Vancouver. And one of his chapters is about the 1907 riots. Many of the other riots are connected with labor movements. And he actually gave a walking tour to start off this project. And he'd been giving walking tours on and off over the years, including during the centennial commemoration in 2007, working with the Chinese Canadian Historical Society. So here's Michael on the, well, next to the cannon with a hat and the red shirt, in front of the Beatty Street Drill Hall, and then walking through Chinatown, walking through Market Alley. That's the way it looked when I took this picture back in 2017. And here they are in front of the Japanese Hall, but not the same building as the one I talked about, because it's not wood. This was built, as you can tell, in 1928. And we set up this makeshift table, well, carefully constructed to look like it was a makeshift table, perhaps from remnants after a riot. And it was a pop-up food project. Here's Michael's son, Chris, next to me there. And here we are sitting in front of where Old Market Hall would be, a bit slightly next door, in front of the Carnegie Center. And here we are after the bus pulls up and people are coming off. Fantastic discussions here at Hastings and Main. And I was most nervous about setting up on that corner. It's not a corner I hang out at too often. But yeah, it was busy and it was really interesting. People know their history in that area, unlike Beatty Street Drill Hall. The people just walking by, going on the SkyTrain, going shopping or whatever, they really don't know. They don't know about Vancouver. My experience. Here in front of the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Garden, just a block away from Shanghai Alley, drew a crowd there, including a couple from Yorkshire, England. And they were asked, do you guys eat roast beef with Yorkshire pudding on Sundays? And they said, yeah, we still do. And here is a photograph from Oppenheimer Park, which, when did it get called out? After Powell Street grounds? It wasn't long after the riots. Yeah, anyways. I've actually revived it as an indoor seated event. We had to charge for the indoor seated event as opposed to outside, which is, whoever comes by, just come by, sit down, have some food, and have a chat about what you know about what happened here in this very spot in 1907. So last year was at the Massey Art Society space across from the Chinese Cultural Center. And then this year, 2 weeks ago, is it? Something like 2 weeks ago, at the Chinese Canadian Museum, also across from the Chinese Cultural Center. And that was a really lovely event. I worked with new chefs this year, Chef Karima Chalouf and her brother Tarek, and they made some fantastic, beautiful food. That in turn, this project, Riot Food here, in turn influenced, well, became 360 Riot Walk, because it was during Michael Barnholden's walking tour where I thought, okay, well, what if we have a self-guided tour? Don't have to wait for Michael to give his occasional walks, and what if it was an interactive visual experience as well? And I came up with a 360 video walking tour idea. So 360riotwalk.ca is the website. There's an audio option where you can choose English or Punjabi or Japanese or Cantonese. And because those were 4 common languages spoken in the area at the time, 1907. There's Squamish Snitcham, the Squamish language embedded in the first track for all of the 4 languages. I tried to get Hunkaminam, but the very few translators who are around, they're all overwhelmed. I was lucky enough to get Celia Joseph to do and she worked with, I forgot her name, and she's in the credits. They collaborated on the translation, and Celia did the voiceover. So that's in all 4 of those languages. And here's a picture of Adiba Muzaffar, who was on the production crew, and she's got the 360 camera there. We embedded archival photographs that we painstakingly colorized, or I should say my crew colorized. I don't really know how to do Photoshop. and they embedded it over the same buildings from 1907. Oh no, sorry, from 2019. This is from 2019. So we took these 360 photographs in 2019, made them black and white, took black and white images, colorized them, embedded them over the same buildings from 2019. And yeah, and these ones are from the Powell Street area. The Powell Street area photographs are well documented because the consulate hired a photographer to basically prepare the case for reparations. And this is an image from stop number 7, which is at Shanghai Alley. There's an image of Cantonese opera floating in the air, head tax certificate on the left, an ad from BC Sugar saying that they only hire white workers, and there's an image of a Chinese coolie there, etc. And here's a part of the 360 Riot Walk tour.
Where you are standing is the beginning of Vancouver, Maple Tree Square. This was also known as Lok Loke, which was a seasonal camp for the indigenous Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Vancouver's first election took place in 1886. 2 months later, the Great Vancouver Fire burned down almost every wooden structure in the new city. The recently elected City Council used this as an opportunity to pass bylaws that restricted anyone who was Chinese from rebuilding. On February 24, 1887, some 300 angry white men raced to the camps of the Chinese laborers at Cole Harbor. They had been hired to clear the land of trees in what is now the West End. There, they attacked the Chinese workers, knocked down their tents, then burned all their bedding, clothing, and provisions. This corner of Carroll and Hastings was the center of Vancouver's first entertainment district. The business interests of the dominant European immigrant community forced communities of color into the more undesirable and precarious areas of the city, forming ethnic ghettos. Anti-Asian and anti-Indigenous sentiment was rampant. Asiatic Exclusion Leagues were formed in all major cities along the West Coast. In 1907, the economy was depressed with increasing unemployment. Over 8,000 Japanese immigrants arrived in the first 10 months of the year, an unprecedented increase from previous years. British Columbia's Attorney General William Bowser proposed an immigration act that would significantly restrict Asians from entering the province. But it was not given royal assent by the Lieutenant Governor, mainly because it violated international treaties with Japan. On September 5th, some 500 Punjabi sawmill workers in Bellingham, 90 kilometers to the south in Washington state, were attacked by white laborers and marched out of town. Those who went north were allowed into Canada only because they were British subjects. Many arrived in Vancouver in time to witness the riots.
Okay, we created these kind of like video simulations of experiencing the 360 video. But if you just go on the website, you can experience it yourself. You can use your mouse or the arrow buttons to move around. You can also zoom in using the keyboard as opposed to your mouse. But it's ideally experienced on a mobile device like a tablet. Tablet's better because it's got more, it's a bigger picture, or your phone, it's really tiny. But anyone can go down and just experience this on site. There's a map to show you where to stand and so forth. But there are guided tours every summer organized by the Powell Street Festival. There's normally about 5 every year. It's $20, or during the Powell Street Festival, it's free. We only allow 10 people at a time because we have 10 tablets. And also, we don't want too big of a crowd because you're standing there on the street corner and yeah, you just don't want to take up too much space. Trying to be respectful of the neighborhood. Here's a map of the 13 stops for the tour. And here's somebody with a tablet during a guided tour. More people with tablets. And I really like this picture because it looks like they're nowhere and looking at nothing. And at the end of the guided tours is a discussion, and that's where so much learning happens. People get to share their experiences and their impressions and have a conversation. And usually I lead those. I don't lead the tour anymore. It's a lot to do, but I show up at the very end there after the tour guide is done. And a local ambassador, someone who really knows the downtown east side and can tell someone else who's getting angry at the group that they're not taking pictures of you, really. This is an art project. They're looking at, a 360 video. And why don't you check it out? And here's a postcard, and you can go on this yourself. So while I was working on this project, I thought, oh, it's not going to last too long. Because it's on the internet. Anything on the internet is going to be obsolete. And I've already had so many problems with Apple's operating system. Every time they change something, the site is not as, it's not the same. I have to wait for software to catch up and then address it and then re-export it and all that stuff and fix all those problems. And then lately there's a Google Maps issue because we embed a Google Map in there. So you know which way you're turning and stuff. And also for the website, for the project, I commissioned some writers to contribute contextualizing essays on different issues that have impacted the community since 1907. And I thought, well, wouldn't this be a great book? And there's so many pictures too. So that's how White Riot came to be. It's the opposite of the history of analog to digital. It's actually digital to analog. But it can also be a guidebook after the website's down and doesn't work anymore. So White Riot was published last spring through Arsenal Pulp Press. And the basis of the book is the script in English. I don't have the other translations in there. The script that Michael Bardenholden and I wrote together. And all the 13 stops are there. And images from the walking tour. And there's a reflective essay that I wrote about the making of the work and some of the issues I faced. There's a foreword by historian Patricia Roy, who did all this amazing archival research on basically the history of white supremacy in British Columbia. And just fact-based, just sharing the information, really, really important foundational work. Her White Man's Province from 1989 really influenced me, continues to do so, and it was such an honor that she agreed to write the foreword. I always get introduction and foreword mixed up. I want to say introduction. Frankly, I don't, whatever. I was told by the publisher, no, this is a foreword, that's an introduction, so okay, fine. There's an essay by the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, 4 members, Stephanie Fung, Anna Liu, Corinne Ng, and Chris Ransarud, that talk about the historic racism within the labor movement. Because, most of the labor movements in Canada have been white people trying to keep non-white people from getting their jobs. It wasn't until later, more recently, that they started to be a bit more inclusive. I think one of the first labor leaders who actually built bridges between different communities and different ethnicities was in the fisheries, fishermen's union. As a white, I can't remember his name, but he brought together the Japanese and the indigenous and the white fishers, and until the canneries managed to do a divide and conquer and got the Japanese to accept some terms, and that kept the others. And anyways, really, really challenging. And then later on, he was assassinated. So he's just gunned down in the street. So be careful if you're a labor union person when you go out on the street. This is Angela May and Nicole Yakashiro's Why We Say Powell Street and Not Japantown. Who calls the Powell Street area Japantown? Somebody must. Because that was just the norm, right? And there are Japanese people who say Japantown too, but they tend to say it to non-Japanese people. Because the people in Powell Street area, they refer to their area as Powell Street or Powder Guy. And Japantown was a term used by outsiders referring to where the Japanese Canadians lived in the downtown east side. They also, so they basically are trying to make that argument, and how it's connected to gentrification or a way of branding the historic Japanese neighborhood in the downtown east side that isn't necessarily as respectful as they would think calling it Powell Street or Powell Guy would be. They don't stake this claim for anywhere else except for here. They're not saying Los Angeles is Japantown, should be called something else. They're just talking about the here and the people, the way people referred to their neighborhood until they were forcibly removed for the internment in 1942. And this is Paul Engelsberg's Bellingham Riot piece, where he's a Bellingham-based historian, and he basically recounts 7 other racially motivated riots, all within 12 months of Vancouver's own riot. So it wasn't an isolated event whatsoever, all on the West Coast. Melody Ma's A Changing Chinatown on Gentrification and Resilience. Melody's a very active activist, fighting for protecting the very poor seniors, especially around the Chinatown area, trying to keep them from getting pushed out and dislocated from their community, and all the different kind of economic and political forces that Chinatown faces, very fraught. And this is Andy Yan's Census Making and City Building, Data Perspectives on the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots and the Development of Vancouver. And he looks at how the census was used as a tool for the social construction of race, and basically as a reflection of the values of the time. They are also a reflection of the values of the time now. The census keeps on being reevaluated. Different questions keep coming up, different names of people and words and ways to identify yourself or be identified if you only have so many options to check, right? And this is Jeff Nasuda, Aaron Franks, and Audrey Kobayashi and Trevor Weidman's and the Right to Remain's research collective's urban rights practice of remaining in Vancouver's downtown east side, examining 150 years of colonial policies of racial containment in the downtown east side. And here's some images. These are I always get it mixed up, equirectilinear or equirectangular photographs. This is what the camera, with its 4 or 6 lenses, I think it's got 4 lenses, how it takes the picture. It's all distorted. So when my production crew asked me, like, okay, is this where you want the embed for the archival photograph? And go, can you flatten it so I can see? Because I can't, I can't follow the lines here. It's pretty hard. So this is the way it comes out, and then it has to be translated in the software program to flatten it so that it looks kind of like the way our eyeballs look. I'm almost done. And the book also is available, the White Riot book, as an artist book, as a special edition. There's only 50 copies. All those curvy photographs, they're all 13 of them, because there's 13 stops on the tour. They're all included as part of this package in this special box, ridiculously expensive box, with the book and signed by myself. So that's, if you're interested in a copy, come and talk to me. I didn't bring one tonight. There's about 12 left out of edition of 50. So that's it. Thank you. And if you have any questions or comments or things that I don't know, I'd appreciate that. Yeah.